Hello, this is my latest painting, and I'm going to be talking about how I do it and why I do certain things. As with all my other paintings, I start off with the big shapes. This is always the same process, and I'll have mountains or whatever's in the background, the floor, and sometimes leading in like a river or road or path or something like that. Generally, something to lead into the painting. And this one is going to be a river. And if you notice, that shape is pretty ugly actually, but it won't matter because it'll be covered by rocks shortly. So I try to make sure I'll enjoy the shapes, which means there's enough interest but not too much interest, and there's a difference between the angles and curves, and there's just enough variety, but it doesn't go crazy. I do the same with the river again, but I'm just about to add some rocks. So the edges of the river, if I'm going to add lots of rocks, are not so important because you won't see too many of the edges. So even though that was an ugly shape, you see now it's mostly gone. So I'm starting to add some trees now, and you notice that I'm messing around with them and I didn't like them, so I deleted them and started again. Quite often it's better to start again than to play around with the shapes. If you really don't like them, it's better to delete them. And especially with this style, it's so quick to try again that it's just much easier. So try a few times, try many times if you have to. It doesn't really matter if you have to try 10 times. Just try 10 times because that's only going to take a few minutes. Okay, so we're on to the highlighting of the mountain. One thing to make sure there is that it's coming from a consistent direction. So I've already chosen that the sun is coming from the right, so make sure it's consistent and you'll be okay. One thing I did there was I really darkened the mountain because I wanted high contrast in this picture. Sometimes and you might say why. Sometimes I choose that I want a really bright painting. Sometimes I want a really contrasty painting. Sometimes a colorful, sometimes moody, etc. So I kind of go into these things with a rough idea of what I want, and I wanted a fast flowing river and a very dark, contrasty mountain. No other reason than I just want this kind of thing sometimes. I might have seen something similar on the internet or something and thought, okay, I'll do that. So one thing to pay a great attention to when you have a flowing river is, well, my trick is to use lots of rocks. The reason I use the rocks is, well, I mean, every river has lots of rocks, to be honest, but one reason for using them when painting is it kind of directs me to where the water flow is going to go, meaning that the water is going to hit the rocks and it's going to move into where the rocks aren't. So basically the high flow is going to go through the gaps. So when you're making your rocks, make sure you have a few gaps, not too many, because it'll look confusing, but just have a few gaps where the water can come through, and that's where the fast flow is going to go and where you want it to be the whitest, which I'll get to in a little bit. But you want to highlight slowly, so put it very dark bluish and then slightly lighter, etc. until you get to almost white, and that's where the highest concentrated water is going to be, and it's going to flow, and that's why it's white. So one thing to keep in mind is, even though the water and the flowing river is going to be the most important part, you've got to make sure that the other parts are taken care of just as well. Maybe not quite as well, but at a reasonable quality so they don't stand out that you spent all your time on whatever your focus is. If it's not a river, it's something else. But make sure that the quality, this is easier said than done, of course, because I've had many problems myself where I can paint a river really well and then I can't paint mountains or whatever. So, depending on your skills, some areas of your painting will look better and some won't. I think I add some sheep later, and not something I do very often, so those quality of the sheep will probably not be as good as the river. So you get my point, but you have to try at least, and eventually when you get better and when we learn how to paint certain things better, we can keep an overall quality the same. So one thing to note here is in my other videos, if I haven't made it clear, I use the selection freehand tool with color fill on, and that's how I block in all these colors. But now and again I use the brushes, not very often. But I want to make it very clear that it doesn't matter which brush I use, and half the time I don't even know. It doesn't really matter. There's only really a few types of brushes. Hard edges, soft edges, and textured. Everything else is not really a big deal to me. I try to paint with a minimal amount of brushes. They can be fun, don't get me wrong, but I prefer to paint and draw with simple brushes. So I'm starting to put a border in. If you've seen any of my other videos, you might have seen this. Well, you definitely will see this because I do it pretty much all the time now. Is I like to have an interest in border, and I do it differently this time. Usually I make the border quite distinct and flat, but this time I wanted a textured border, which I think I prefer overall, so I don't know why I don't do it more often. But the reason I'm doing these borders is digital painting can be very neat. Being the word, it can be very neat, and sometimes we need some texture to make it look a bit more real. Of course it's not, but that's what we're trying to do. So one thing to note here, you see me trying to put these trees in the background. I thought we could do with some background trees, some pine trees or something like that. They really didn't work. You could probably leave them there and it's not going to kill the painting, but you will see me delete them later. So I experiment a lot while I'm painting, and that's kind of what I'm doing. I have no idea what this painting is going to turn out like when I start. I have very little idea of what I'm going to do. I'm basically just experimenting the entire time and seeing what works and what doesn't work. And quite often things really don't work, and that's okay. This is what I mean about the textured border. You can use any brush. It doesn't really matter. I think I'm using burnt tree or something like that. But whatever brush and texture you like to use, just use that. It's really up to you. But what we're trying to do is make the painting look more interesting, basically. So we're coming towards the end. I'm not going to do much more here. I'm just trying to finish things off and tweak a few things. One trick, if you're trying to change the colors, you see me changing the colors here. I zoom out really far because when you want to change something that impacts the entire painting, you don't want to be looking at details. So if you zoom out, you can only see things that really matter, and sometimes they don't matter. So be careful to not tweak things, kind of pointlessly forever. And the easy way to do that is you zoom out and you make your changes. Did they make any difference? And you'll find quite often if you're zoomed out, they don't make any difference at all. So I'm quite guilty of that. And it's quite easy to tweak things for no reason. So I'm coming to the end now and just adding in a few highlights. So I hope this was useful. If it was, give me a like and subscribe, and I'll see you later. Thanks.